The fluorescent lights above my desk hummed with that specific, headache-inducing frequencies that had been the soundtrack to my professional life for 14 years. My name is Daniel Cross, and I am 55 years old. For over a decade, I had been the unseen architectural backbone of this company, constructing the hiring protocols, designing the rigorous employee training curriculums, and laying the fundamental groundwork that allowed this multi-million-dollar logistics enterprise to function smoothly. I was the Director of People Development, a title that sounded warm and inviting to outsiders, but internally, it meant I was the quiet guardian of institutional memory. I arrived at the corporate center every morning at 6:45, ensuring the automated training modules were properly synchronized across our regional offices before the rest of the staff even logged into their workstations. I did not require praise. I did not demand flashy awards or public recognition during the annual corporate retreats. My satisfaction came from watching the systems I built operate with flawless precision, knowing that the foundation I had laid was sturdy enough to weather any storm. However, the corporate ecosystem is inherently volatile, and stability is often perceived as complacency by those who worship disruption. The atmosphere within our headquarters shifted drastically 3 months ago when the board of directors installed Julian Thorne as the new chief of strategy implementation. Julian was 31 years old, possessed a graduate degree from an elite business institution, and wore tailored suits that looked excessively expensive for his actual pay grade. He carried himself with the unearned confidence of a man who believed every thought that crossed his mind was a revolutionary breakthrough in modern management theory. Upon his arrival, Julian immediately began dismantling the structural integrity of the company, replacing proven operational frameworks with empty buzzwords like synergy, dynamic pivoting, and lean optimization. He restructured entire departments without consulting the veteran managers, alienated the long-term workforce, and paraded through the office as if he had personally founded the enterprise. To Julian, I was nothing more than an artifact of a bygone era. He viewed the People Development Department as an unnecessary drain on corporate resources, a collection of outdated practices that hindered his vision of a streamlined, hyper-efficient corporate machine. During our first departmental review meeting, Julian had barely glanced at my comprehensive 50-page quarterly report before tossing it across the mahogany conference table. He had leaned back in his designer chair, steepled his fingers, and declared that my training programs were archaic fluff that failed to deliver measurable return on investment. I had simply nodded, maintaining a perfectly neutral expression, and quietly documented his profound lack of understanding regarding our regulatory compliance requirements. The true conflict, however, began to simmer when Julian started aggressively scrutinizing my departmental budget. Over the past 3 years, I had strategically allocated $45,000 from the training fund towards specialized executive governance courses, advanced fiduciary responsibility workshops, and external legal consulting sessions for myself and a select group of trusted senior colleagues. To the untrained eye, these expenses might have appeared excessive or unrelated to standard employee onboarding, but they were not standard training modules. They were meticulous preparations for a corporate defense strategy that I had been developing for years, anticipating the day when an incompetent executive like Julian would threaten the fundamental stability of the company. Julian, possessing the investigative subtlety of a sledgehammer, flagged these expenses during a highly publicized financial audit. He saw the $45,000 and immediately concluded that I was misusing corporate funds to enrich my own professional credentials. He did not bother to investigate the nature of the legal consulting sessions. He did not cross-reference these voices with the board-approved development initiatives. He simply saw an opportunity to eliminate a senior director who stood in the way of his radical restructuring plans. On a crisp Tuesday morning, Julian summoned me to the central glass-walled conference room. The invitation, sent at exactly 8:15, was titled Strategic Realignment Discussion, a classic corporate euphemism for termination. I did not experience a spike in adrenaline. My heart rate remained remarkably steady. I gathered my favorite black fountain pen, slipped a leather folio under my arm, and walked down the long corridor with the measured pace of a man who knows exactly how the game is going to end. When I entered the room, Julian was already seated at the head of the table, flanked by two solemn representatives from the Human Resources Department. His expression was a carefully practiced mask of corporate regret, attempting to conceal the predatory gleam of triumph in his eyes. He motioned for me to sit, sliding a thick stack of termination documents across the polished surface. The documents detailed the immediate elimination of my position, citing budgetary constraints and a strategic pivot away from traditional training methodology. Daniel, we appreciate the 14 years you have dedicated to this organization. Julian began, his voice dripping with condescending formality. However, the landscape is shifting. We have reviewed your recent departmental expenditures, specifically the $45,000 allocated to questionable executive consulting sessions, and we have concluded that this constitutes a severe misuse of corporate resources. Your position is being eliminated, effective immediately. He paused, expecting a reaction. He expected outrage, denial, or a desperate plea for reconsideration. He expected the typical emotional collapse of a veteran employee whose entire professional identity had just been erased. I provided none of that arrangement. I did not raise my voice. I did not offer a defense of my expenditures. I simply uncapped my fountain pen, leaned forward, and signed the termination documents with smooth, deliberate strokes. I pushed the papers back across the table, maintaining unbroken eye contact with the young, arrogant executive who believed he had just outsmarted me. "Do what you must, Julian," I said softly, my voice perfectly calm and devoid of malice. "I look forward to formally introducing myself at Monday's board meeting." Julian blinked, a flicker of genuine confusion disrupting his practiced facade. He opened his mouth to respond, perhaps to mock my statement, but he was interrupted by the heavy, silent arrival of the security personnel standing outside the glass doors, ready to escort me from the premises. I stood up, buttoned my suit jacket, and walked out of the conference room, leaving Julian to ponder the precise meaning of my final words. He had no idea what was coming. The walk from the central conference room to the main exit of the corporate headquarters was a surreal experience. The two security guards flanked me with practiced stoicism, their heavy boots thudding against the polished marble floor. We passed rows of cubicles, where my former colleagues quickly averted their eyes, pretending to be deeply engrossed in their spreadsheets. They had all witnessed the public execution of a 14-year veteran, and fear hung in the air like a thick, suffocating fog. Julian Thorne had intended this public escort to be the ultimate humiliation, a demonstration of his absolute authority to the remaining staff. He wanted them to see that no one, regardless of tenure or past contributions, was safe from his lean optimization crusade. What Julian failed to comprehend was that I was not walking away in defeat. I was marching toward the culmination of a strategy that had been meticulously constructed over the better part of a decade. Once the heavy glass doors of the lobby closed behind me, shutting out the oppressive hum of the corporate environment, the crisp morning air felt incredibly sharp and invigorating. I did not carry a cardboard box filled with desk plants or framed photographs. I had deliberately kept my workspace austere, leaving behind nothing of personal value. My true assets were secured entirely outside the physical confines of that building. I walked to my sedan, unlocked the door with a sharp click, and slid into the driver's seat. For a long moment, I simply sat there in the quiet isolation of the vehicle, the engine silent, staring at the imposing facade of the corporate center I had helped build. I took a deep, centering breath, allowing the reality of the morning's events to settle. Then I reached into the breast pocket of my suit, retrieved my personal mobile phone, and dialed a number I had committed to memory years ago. "The termination has been executed exactly as we anticipated," I stated clearly when the line connected. Maxwell Croft, the chairman of the board of directors, responded with a low, resonant hum of acknowledgement. Maxwell was a man who appreciated precision and detested unnecessary complications. He used the external consulting fees as the primary justification. Word for word, I confirmed, a small, grim smile forming on my lips. He believes he has permanently eliminated a redundant employee who was draining the corporate coffers. Excellent. Maxwell replied, the satisfaction evident in his tone. The documentation is fully prepared on my end. Enjoy your brief sabbatical, Daniel. We have a significant amount of restructuring to accomplish on Monday morning. I ended the calls, started the engine, and merged onto the highway, feeling a profound sense of tranquility. To understand the gravity of the impending Monday board meeting, one must understand the hidden architectural flaws of Julian Thorne's perceived empire. 14 years ago, when this company was merely a struggling startup, operating out of a cramped industrial park, I was one of the first 5 employees hired by the original founder, in lieu of a competitive salary, which the company could not afford. At the time, I had negotiated a highly unusual compensation package. The founder, desperate for my expertise in organizational development, had granted me a substantial equity stake, complete with a foundational voting rights clause that remained active as long as I retained my shares. Over the years, as the company expanded exponentially and underwent multiple rounds of investment restructuring, the vast majority of the newer executives and board members completely forgot about those original foundational agreements. They assumed the power dynamics had shifted entirely to the venture capital firms and the loud, aggressive managers like Julian. They were profoundly mistaken. I had never sold a single share. I had quietly, patiently maintained my equity, allowing it to appreciate while I continued my work in the background. My silent holdings amounted to exactly 37.5% of the total corporate voting power. Furthermore, through careful alliances and those specialized executive governance courses that Julian had so brazenly classified as a misuse of funds, I had secured the binding proxy votes of 2 other original minority shareholders. Combined with my own equity, our coalition controlled a staggering 53% of the voting rights. We possessed the absolute, unassailable legal authority to override any executive decision, terminate any corporate officer, and completely reshape the leadership structure of the organization. Julian had fired me for authorizing $45,000 in legal consulting fees. What he did not know, and what the Human Resources Department had failed to uncover during their superficial investigation, was that those legal fees were paid to an elite corporate governance law firm. I had retained them to thoroughly audit our company's bylaws, ensure the ironclad legality of my voting coalition, and draft the precise motions required to initiate a hostile executive removal. The training budget had not been wasted. It had been weaponized to protect the company from the very man who had just signed my termination papers. The weekend stretched before me like a quiet battlefield before the dawn engagement. I did not spend my time updating my resume or scrolling through professional networking sites. Instead, I retreated to my home office, a meticulously organized space lined with legal reference books and financial ledgers. I spent Saturday reviewing the thick binder of documentation provided by the corporate governance law firm. Every clause, every subsection, and every precedent was memorably ingrained in my mind. I reviewed the specific statutes regarding executive fiduciary duty, ensuring that Julian's recent actions, particularly his unauthorized restructuring of the procurement department and his aggressive termination of senior staff without board approval, could be legally classified as a breach of his obligations to the shareholders. By Sunday evening, I felt a quiet, overwhelming sense of readiness. I had spent 14 years observing, listening, and fortifying the structural integrity of this organization. Julian Thorne believed he had achieved a masterstroke of corporate efficiency by discarding me. He had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of power. True corporate power does not reside in loud proclamations, tailored suits, or aggressive management tactics. It resides in the silent, unyielding text of legally binding contracts, the quiet accumulation of equity, and the precise, devastating application of institutional knowledge. I laid out my best dark navy suit, selected a conservative tie, and prepared for the reckoning. Monday morning was rapidly approaching, and the chief of strategy implementation was about to receive a profound, unforgettable lesson in the true mechanics of corporate dominance. The atmosphere within the executive boardroom on Monday morning was charged with an electric, almost palpable sense of anticipation. The room was a sprawling expanse of glass and polished mahogany, offering a panoramic view of the city skyline that seemed to mirror the towering egos of the individuals seated around the table. Julian Thorne sat at the head of the boardroom, radiating an obnoxious level of self-satisfaction. He was presenting his revised quarterly strategic roadmap, a chaotic assortment of aggressive cost-cutting measures and superficial departmental rebrandings. He gestured animatedly toward the digital projection screen, detailing his successful elimination of legacy overhead, a thinly veiled reference to my recent termination. The other executive officers nodded along, some out of genuine agreement, but most out of a deeply ingrained instinct for professional self-preservation. None of them wanted to be the next target of Julian's relentless optimization campaign. Maxwell Croft, the chairman of the board, sat quietly near the center of the table, his hands steepled beneath his chin. He listened to Julian's presentation with an expression of polite, unreadable interest. The general counsel, Wallet, sat to Maxwell's right, meticulously reviewing a stack of documents that Julian assumed were routine compliance reports. The chief financial officer, Peterson, furiously tapped numbers into his tablet, desperately trying to reconcile Julian's fantastical financial projections with the harsh realities of our actual revenue streams. It was a perfect tableau of corporate dysfunction, a fragile ecosystem teetering on the edge of collapse, sustained only by Julian's sheer volume and intimidation tactics. At precisely 9:15, the heavy oak doors of the boardroom swung open with a smooth, decisive click. The room fell into an immediate, stunned silence as I stepped across the threshold. I was not wearing the slightly rumpled, practical attire of the people development director they were accustomed to ignoring. I was dressed in an impeccably tailored navy suit, carrying the thick, leather-bound binder containing the legally verified documentation of my shareholder coalition. I walked with the measured, unhurried pace of a man who owned the floor beneath his feet. Julian's presentation ground to a halting stop mid-sentence. His hand, previously gesturing toward a graph depicting projected synergy savings, froze in midair. The look of supreme confidence on his face shattered, rapidly replaced by a mixture of profound confusion and rising panic. He glanced toward the doorway, expecting security personnel to appear and drag me away, but the hallway remained conspicuously empty. "Daniel?" Julian stammered, his voice lacking its usual aggressive resonance. "What is the meaning of this intrusion? You were officially terminated on Tuesday. Security should have deactivated your access credentials." I did not immediately respond to Julian. Instead, I walked directly to the empty chair situated precisely opposite him at the far end of the long mahogany table. I placed my leather binder onto the polished surface with a deliberate, echoing thud and took my seat. Only then did I meet his gaze, my expression completely devoid of emotion. "Good morning, Julian," I said smoothly, my voice carrying effortlessly across the silent room. My employee access credentials were indeed deactivated. However, my foundational equity access credentials remain fully operational. I am attending this meeting not as an employee, but as the majority shareholder representative. A collective murmur rippled through the seated executives. Peterson, the chief financial officer, dropped his stylus onto the table with a sharp clatter. Wallace, the general counsel, adjusted his spectacles, a faint, knowing smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Julian's complexion transitioned from a healthy tan to a sickly, ashen gray. He looked frantically toward Maxwell Croft, seeking intervention. "Maxwell, this is highly irregular," Julian protested, his voice cracking slightly under the strain of sudden uncertainty. "We cannot allow terminated, disgruntled former employees to disrupt critical executive strategy sessions. I demand that he be removed immediately." Maxwell Croft slowly unfolded his hands and leaned forward, his gaze fixed intensely on Julian. "Daniel is not disrupting the meeting, Julian. He is fulfilling his legal obligation as the representative of the majority voting coalition, a coalition that currently holds 53% of this company's active voting shares. He has every right to be here, and we are legally bound to recognize his presence and any motions he wishes to present." The revelation struck Julian with the devastating force of a physical blow. The concept of foundational equity, of silent power accumulating in the background while he paraded around demanding respect, was entirely alien to his modern management philosophy. He had operated under the fatal assumption that a chief of strategy title granted him absolute sovereignty over the organization. He had completely ignored the complex, legally binding history that predated his arrival by over a decade. 53%? Julian repeated weakly, his eyes darting frantically between me and Maxwell. That is impossible. The venture capital rounds heavily diluted the original shareholder blocks. The documentation must be flawed. This is a desperate bluff. I assure you, Julian, there is no bluff, I interjected calmly, opening my leather binder and extracting the first set of notarized documents. The original equity contracts contained an anti-dilution provision linked directly to the founding members' continued retention of their initial share allocations, a provision that I and two of my original colleagues have maintained meticulously for 14 years. Wallace has already reviewed the documentation and verified its absolute legal standing. Wallace nodded gravely, tapping his own stack of papers. The documents are ironclad, Julian. Daniel's coalition possesses the overriding voting authority to compel immediate board action. Julian sank back into his designer chair, the realization of his catastrophic miscalculation finally taking root, the very funds he had cited to justify my termination. The $45,000 spent on elite legal consulting had been the exact instrument used to cement the coalition that was now poised to destroy his career. He had handed me the ammunition, pointed the weapon at himself, and demanded that I pull the trigger. Furthermore, I continued, my tone shifting from calm exposition to cold, precise authority. The majority coalition is profoundly dissatisfied with the current trajectory of this organization under the guidance of the Chief of Strategy Implementation. Specifically, we have identified multiple instances of severe fiduciary negligence, unauthorized departmental restructuring, and aggressive termination practices that violate fundamental corporate governance standards. I retrieved a second document from my binder, a meticulously detailed report compiled during those expensive consulting sessions. It outlined every erratic decision, every unsubstantiated financial projection, and every hostile human resources maneuver Julian had executed since his arrival. It was a comprehensive, legally actionable indictment of his entire tenure. I slid the document across the mahogany table. It came to rest precisely in front of Julian Thorne, a stark white testament to his impending professional ruin. The room remained suffocatingly silent, waiting for the final, inevitable blow to be delivered. Julian stared at the indictment resting on the table as if it were a highly venomous serpent preparing to strike. The bravado that had defined his entire corporate existence had evaporated entirely, leaving behind the hollow, terrified shell of a man who suddenly realized he was standing on the wrong side of an inescapable legal trap. He looked around the boardroom, silently pleading with the other executives for support, for a single dissenting voice to challenge the authority of my coalition. But the executives were seasoned professionals. They recognized a fatal shift in power dynamics when they saw one. They kept their eyes firmly fixed on their notepads, their tablets, or their intertwined hands, refusing to offer Julian even the slightest glimmer of solidarity. They had tolerated his arrogant management style when they believed he held the absolute backing of the board, but now that the true locus of power had been revealed, they abandoned him with brutal efficiency. This is absurd. Julian finally managed to sputter, attempting to project a sense of righteous indignation that failed miserably. You cannot simply walk in here and overturn months of strategic progress based on an obscure, outdated technicality. The company is leaner. Our projected margins are higher. I have optimized the entire operational structure. You have not optimized anything, Julian, I replied, my voice steady and unyielding. You have merely cannibalized the foundational infrastructure of this company to manufacture the illusion of short-term profitability. You eliminated the training programs that ensured our compliance with federal industry standards. You fired veteran staff members whose institutional knowledge was the only thing preventing our supply chain from collapsing under the weight of your aggressive cost-cutting measures. Your strategic progress is a fragile house of cards, and the majority coalition refuses to allow you to continue jeopardizing our investments. I turned my attention away from Julian and addressed Maxwell Croft directly. Mr. Chairman, as the representative of the majority voting coalition, I am officially submitting a formal motion for an immediate vote of no confidence regarding the current Chief of Strategy Implementation, Julian Thorne. The motion includes a demand for his immediate termination, effective today, with cause, citing a severe breach of fiduciary duty and gross managerial negligence. The words hung in the air, cold, precise, and utterly devastating. Julian gasped, his hands gripping the edge of the mahogany table with white-knuckled desperation. Termination with cause meant the immediate forfeiture of his lucrative severance package, the cancellation of his unvested stock options, and a permanent, glaring stain on his professional executive record. It was the absolute destruction of the corporate persona he had so carefully crafted. Maxwell, you cannot allow this, Julian pleaded, his voice rising in pitch, sounding remarkably like a panicked child. I was recruited specifically to disrupt the stagnation in this company. I have executed the mandate I was given. You must overrule this motion. Maxwell Croft sighed, a slow, heavy exhalation that signaled the absolute finality of the situation. He looked at Julian not with anger, but with a profound, dismissive pity. I cannot overrule a legally binding motion presented by a verified majority shareholder coalition, Julian. Furthermore, having reviewed the documentation provided by Daniel regarding your unauthorized departmental restructuring and the severe compliance risks you have introduced, the board is deeply inclined to support the motion. Your methods have proven too reckless, and the resulting liabilities are entirely unacceptable. Maxwell paused, ensuring the full weight of his statements settled over the room before proceeding. The motion for a vote of no confidence and immediate termination with cause has been presented. All those in favor, please indicate by raising your hand. It was a procedural formality, given the overwhelming voting power my coalition possessed, but the visual impact was undeniable. I raised my right hand slowly and deliberately. Wallace, the general counsel, immediately raised his hand. Peterson, the chief financial officer, hesitated for barely a second before raising his hand as well. One by one, every single executive officer and board members seated around that expansive mahogany table raised their hands in unanimous support of the motion. Julian was completely isolated, surrounded by a sea of raised hands that silently condemned his arrogance, his incompetence, and his fundamental misunderstanding of true corporate power. The vote was unanimous. The destruction was total. The motion carries, Maxwell Croft announced, his voice devoid of any emotion. Julian Thorne, your employment as Chief of Strategy Implementation is terminated, effective immediately. You are directed to surrender all company-issued devices, security credentials, and confidential materials to the Human Resources Department forthwith. You will be escorted from the premises. Julian sat frozen, staring at the raised hands, as if unable to process the reality of his situation. The man who had strutted through the office a week prior, casually destroying careers and dismissing decades of hard work as archaic fluff, was now struggling to comprehend his own sudden, absolute downfall. He slowly lowered his head, the remaining fragments of his arrogant facade finally crumbling away entirely. I need to call my attorney, Julian whispered, his voice trembling so severely it was barely audible. You are certainly within your rights to seek legal counsel, Julian, Wallace interjected, his tone clinical and detached. However, given the extensive documentation regarding your fiduciary negligence, I strongly advise you to carefully consider the potential consequences of pursuing retaliatory litigation. The evidence against your management practices is overwhelming, and the board will mount an aggressive, highly publicized defense if necessary. It was the final, definitive checkmate. Wallace had expertly closed the only remaining avenue of escape, making it abundantly clear that any attempt by Julian to salvage his reputation through legal action would only result in further public humiliation and potential financial ruin. Julian slowly stood up from his designer chair, his movements stiff and uncoordinated. He did not look at me. He did not look at Maxwell or Wallace. He simply gathered his tablet, turned around, and walked toward the heavy oak doors with the defeated, shuffling gait of a man who had lost absolutely everything. As he reached for the brass handle, the doors swung open from the outside, revealing the same two security guards who had escorted me from the building less than a week ago. They stepped aside, offering Julian the identical stoic treatment he had demanded for me. The irony was palpable, a silent, poetic conclusion to a masterfully executed corporate coup. The heavy oak doors clicked shut behind Julian, leaving a profound, resonant silence in the boardroom. The oppressive energy that had characterized his brief, disastrous tenure evaporated instantly, replaced by a collective exhalation of relief from the remaining executives. Peterson practically collapsed into his chair, wiping a thin layer of perspiration from his forehead. The others exchanged cautious, bewildered glances, still processing the sheer magnitude and speed of the corporate coup they had just witnessed. They had arrived at the meeting expecting another grueling session of buzzword-laden demands and arbitrary budget cuts. Instead, they had watched the silent execution of a hostile takeover orchestrated by a man they had previously dismissed as an obsolete relic of the Human Resources Department. I remained seated at the end of the mahogany table, my hands resting lightly on the leather binder. I did not smile, I did not gloat. The satisfaction I felt was deep and internal, a profound sense of validation derived from the successful execution of a complex long-term strategy. I had protected my legacy, safeguarded my substantial investment, and eliminated a toxic element that threatened the fundamental stability of the organization. The $45,000 spent on elite legal consulting had indeed yielded the highest return on investment of any expenditure in the company's recent history. Maxwell Croft cleared his throat, commanding the immediate attention of the room. He adjusted his posture, transitioning smoothly from the role of an impartial observer to that of a decisive leader, prepared to navigate the sudden vacuum of power. "The immediate crisis has been resolved," Maxwell stated, his voice steady and authoritative. "However, we are now faced with the significant task of stabilizing our operational structure and repairing the internal damage inflicted during Julian's tenure. We require an individual who possesses an intimate, comprehensive understanding of our foundational protocols, someone capable of restoring compliance standards and rebuilding the trust of our veteran workforce." Maxwell paused, turning his gaze directly toward me. "Daniel, considering your unprecedented equity position, your unparalleled institutional knowledge, and your clear demonstration of strategic foresight, the board requests that you accept the position of Interim Chief Executive Officer, effective immediately. We require you to assume total operational control while we conduct a thorough, deliberate search for a permanent replacement. Assuming, of course, that you do not ultimately decide to retain the position permanently yourself." The offer hung in the air, a formal acknowledgement of my absolute authority over the company I had helped build from the ground up. 14 years of meticulous planning, quiet observation, and strategic accumulation of equity had culminated in this precise moment. The executives who had previously ignored me now looked toward me with a mixture of profound respect and healthy apprehension. They recognized that the quiet, unassuming director of people development had possessed the power to dismantle their entire hierarchy with a single legally binding motion. "I accept the position, Mr. Chairman," I replied calmly, opening my leather binder to a fresh, blank page and uncapping my fountain pen. "We have a significant amount of work to accomplish. The first order of business will be the immediate reinstatement of the corporate training programs and the comprehensive review of all departmental restructuring initiated over the past 3 months. The era of lean optimization has officially concluded. We are returning to a foundation of stability, compliance, and rigorous operational competence." The ensuing weeks were a period of intense, focused reconstruction. The atmosphere within the corporate headquarters transformed dramatically. The pervasive fear and uncertainty that had plagued the staff under Julian's aggressive management style were rapidly replaced by a renewed sense of purpose and stability. I systematically reversed his disastrous cost-cutting measures, reinstating the veteran employees who possessed the critical institutional knowledge necessary for the company's long-term survival. I mandated rigorous compliance training across all departments, ensuring that the organization was fully insulated against the types of regulatory liabilities Julian had recklessly ignored. The executive Boardroom, previously a toxic environment of intimidation and ego, became a space for deliberate, strategic collaboration. The remaining officers quickly adapted to the new reality, understanding that their continued employment depended on their adherence to strict operational protocols rather than flashy presentations and empty jargon. They had learned a harsh, unforgettable lesson about the true nature of corporate power. As for Julian Thorne, his departure from the corporate world was absolute and unceremonious. The termination with cause severely damaged his professional reputation, making it virtually impossible for him to secure a comparable executive position within the industry. He had attempted to construct an empire based on arrogance, intimidation, and a profound disregard for the foundational mechanics of corporate governance. He had fundamentally failed to understand that the individuals he dismissed as outdated relics were often the very architects who designed the structures supporting his perceived power. Sitting in the expansive corner office that now served as the command center for the entire organization, I occasionally reflected on that crisp Tuesday morning when Julian had smugly handed me my termination papers. He had believed he was eliminating a minor obstacle, a redundant expense on a spreadsheet. He had been completely unaware that he was triggering a meticulously designed legal mechanism that would ultimately destroy his career and elevate me to the highest position of authority within the company. The quiet, meticulous work of building alliances, auditing contracts, and deeply understanding the complex web of corporate bylaws had proven to be the ultimate weapon in the modern corporate battlefield. The true architects of an organization rarely seek the spotlight. They prefer to operate in the background, securing the foundations and ensuring the structural integrity of the enterprise. And when those foundations are threatened by arrogant incompetence, the silent guardians are always prepared to emerge from the shadows, armed with the devastating power of the written contract, to restore order and claim their rightful place at the head of the table. The lesson was clear, brutal, and utterly definitive. Never underestimate the individual who built the system you are attempting to conquer.